We learn about Roman history from textbooks, don't we? And if we want to delve deeper, we turn to the great Roman historians, Livy, Tacitus, or Cassius Dio. Cassius Dio, in particular, becomes our most valuable guide to the 2nd century CE, a time when other sources are sparse or fragmented. His monumental Roman history provides a sweeping account of the empire's triumphs and tribulations, shaping much of what we know about this period. But are literary sources enough? Why should we bother with the so-called documentary sources like inscriptions, papyri, or coins? What do they really add to our understanding of antiquity? Documentary sources might not weave grand narratives, but they ground history in tangible reality. For Marcus Valerius Maximianus, the protagonist of this story, inscriptions allow us to piece together his life, his military achievements, his governorship, and his consulship. Without this epigraphic evidence, Maximianus would be a ghost, completely ignored by the literary sources of his age. His story, reconstructed from these fragmented documents, shows us the practical realities of Roman administration and military life in ways no historian of his time ever did. That said, a word of caution. What follows is a fictionalized account. We know, for example, that Maximianus had a wife named Ulpia Aristonica, that much is certain. The name Aristonica suggests an origin in the East, but beyond that, we can only speculate. Was she connected to the imperial house of Trajan? Perhaps, since Ulpius was the family name of Trajan's father and was commonly given to freedmen or those granted Roman citizenship by members of the Ulpian family. In this story, we'll also explore the wines of Roman times, though we have no evidence that the real Maximianus had a taste for Falernian or Mariotic, but as a good Roman, he likely did. More importantly, we'll delve into the career paths of Roman soldiers, particularly those of the equestrian order and the tres militiae, the three-step ladder for Roman knights. Along the way, we'll uncover the blend of ambition, duty, and legacy that defined men like Maximianus. So let's begin this story into the life of Marcus Valerius Maximianus, a man whose story lives on not through grand histories, but through the enduring words chiseled into stone. The sandy desert winds swept across the arid plains of Diana Veteranorum, a town in Roman Numidia, where many veterans, especially those of the 3rd Legion, had been granted land to settle down. This was a common practice in the Roman Empire. Veterans typically received farmland after 25 years of service in the auxiliary forces or 20 years of service in the legions. As an alternative, they could also ask for a cash bonus, the premium, which right now, in the early 180s, was a substantial sum. Still, many chose the land, the size of which varied from province to province. Here, in North Africa, they might have received a bit less because the soil was so fertile. This reward system was both an incentive for service and a way to integrate veterans into local societies, often in frontier regions, where they could help secure Roman control. It was late afternoon in Diana Veteranorum, and slowly, weaving from one side to the other, a man approached. People would whisper that this was no one less than the future governor of the province. Some said he might one day even become a consul. Marcus Valerius Maximianus was genuinely plastered. Good heavens, this had been a formidable lunch. He had met a few old army comrades at a bar where he had just had his second glass of breakfast wine, men with whom he had fought in campaigns in every corner of the empire. The good old days, you know. So many battles, so many stories. At some point they had decided to go for a snack. The food was amazing and so was the wine. Maximianus felt like a sailor on shore leave, but he still wanted to have a look at the stone slab. Tomorrow the stone cutter was going to carve the inscription. Maximianus staggered quite a bit until he arrived at the still empty stone soon to be inscribed with all of his achievements. Bloody hell, he still had to proofread the text once more. Once carved, you know, you can't change an inscription, he said to himself. His wife, Ulpia Aristonica, good patient Ulpia, had almost laughed herself to death this morning when she had seen his draft of the text. He had written Parthians instead of Parthians. Yes, the Parthians. When he had been on campaign in the east, when they were waging war against these eastern farters, his soldiers had eaten so many lentils, beans, and chickpeas that they themselves had farted all day. But yeah, he definitely had to read through the text again at home, lest such an embarrassing mistake remain. This was not the first inscription that Maximianus had commissioned. On the contrary, there are only few individuals from his level of society from whom we have more inscriptions than from him. His level of society, that was the equestrian order, so vital for the administration of the empire. But this inscription from Diana Veteranorum was one of the longest Maximianus ever had commissioned, and it provides us with almost his full career until roughly 183 or 185 CE. Its content will be the basis for this video. It was discovered in 1955, close to Batna in modern-day Algeria. And it seems that Maximianus did not check the text again. In the fourth line, we can read that he was honored for his achievements in the Parthian Wars. Damn it! Here it was, alive, chiseled into stone. Marcus Valerius Maximianus, soldier, leader, and at some point designated consul, though indeed not yet in this inscription. Not bad for a boy from the countryside, from Poetovio in Pannonia Superior, modern-day Ptuj in Slovenia. Maximianus had been at the edges of the empire, fought its wars, tasted its wines, seen its dangers, and indulged in its pleasures. But no ancient historian has written a single line about him. His life and career are only known to us from documentary sources, from the inscriptions that he commissioned in all corners of the Imperium Romanum. The Roman imperial army was built on mobility, ensuring troops and their commanders could be deployed rapidly across the vast empire. Legionaries rarely stayed in one location for their entire service. Instead, they moved with their units to where they were needed most, whether quelling rebellions, defending borders, or launching offensive campaigns. This mobility was essential to maintain control over the provinces, react to external threats, and enforce Roman authority across the known world. For soldiers, this constant movement meant a life of uncertainty, but also of opportunity. It exposed them to different cultures, landscapes, and experiences, creating a sense of shared identity as Romans regardless of their provincial origins. Commanders like Marcus Valerius Maximianus thrived in this system, and their careers would, as a rule, span the entire Roman world. This lifestyle also meant soldiers formed temporary bonds with local communities, avoiding long-term entanglements that could weaken their allegiance to Rome. Strategically, rotating troops prevented stagnation and mutiny and ensured that armies remained disciplined and loyal, well, most of the time, and in theory at least. In the last days, Maximianus had been on a serious trip down memory lane. This was going to be more than a mere inscription. It was a testament to decades of service to Rome. Each line would speak of battles fought, territories governed, and honors bestowed. Sure, you had to pay the stonecutter by the letter. That's why Maximianus relied on the common abbreviations used in Roman inscriptions. But it was worth it. Officially, of course, it was the city council of Diana Veteranorum that was setting up the inscriptions, but sure, everybody knew that he himself had paid for it by a sizable donation beforehand. Reflecting the steps of his impressive career was, however, also useful for a completely different reason. Just last week, his wife Ulpia had been to the Diana Veteranorum country club in the mountains, where everybody was crazy about a new ball game invented in Britannia. They called it Ludus Reticulatus. Ulpia doubted that this would get popular, but people always like what's new. Maximianus and Ulpia were more traditional. Anyways, apart from the news about that game, Ulpia had met a young bloke from the Greek East, and she was quite happy that she found someone to talk to in her native tongue, for she rarely spoke Greek anymore after their wedding. This guy's name was Lucius Cassius, and he had just been made senator by none other than the most noble Emperor Commodus. What an honor! Though, honestly, it was hardly surprising. Cassius was one of those pampered rich kids from the senatorial class, the kind who believed the toga made the man. Maximianus was unimpressed when Ulpia announced she'd invited Cassius for dinner. Why? Maximianus had groaned. Ulpia had explained it was a clever move to keep on Cassius's good side. After all, while Cassius was ostensibly supposed to channel his energies into governing the Roman Empire, he had apparently decided that pen and parchment were his true calling. Worse still, he'd started calling himself Cassius Dio, as if naming himself after the great Greek orator Dio Chrysostomus, golden-mouthed Dio, would make him sound profound rather than pretentious. What an insufferable idiot, Maximianus thought. Cassius Dio, the next Livy or Tacitus, sure. Let's see how long that lasts. Maximianus had no patience for historians. They were all quills, no spine. He preferred action, the thrill of command, not scribbling critiques of other people's accomplishments. When Maximianus had left for the military service, his father had once bought him the complete works of Tacitus, no doubt imagining Maximianus would spend his evenings deep in contemplation of imperial politics. But then, when a minor financial misunderstanding arose at a certain lupanar, it turned out that the histories made excellent currency. The pimp had been happy to take the volumes in lieu of coin. Good riddance, Maximianus had thought, as the last of Tacitus's biting prose left his hands. The reading hadn't been enjoyable anyway. How could a Roman writer be so infuriatingly critical of the emperor, of the very institution of empire? Weren't emperors the gods' chosen protectors of humanity? If Maximianus could resurrect Tacitus for one day, it wouldn't be to hear his views on government. No, Maximianus would have liked to beat the living daylight out of him. Insulting the emperor, that Maximianus simply would not tolerate. But Ulpia had cut off his rant with that sharp look she reserved for moments of supreme exasperation. This Cassius Dio twat, she explained, was running around collecting eyewitness accounts for his chapters on the Marcomannic Wars. And really, who could be a better source on the Marcomannic Wars than Maximianus himself, the man who had personally killed Valerius, the terrifying leader of the Naristi tribe? This act of heroism had earned him special honors. Back at headquarters, near where Emperor Marcus Aurelius would soon establish the city of Castra Regina, later Regensburg, the hometown of this story's narrator, the emperor himself had praised Maximianus in front of the troops. As a reward, he presented him with the decorations and weapons and the horse of Valerius. Quite a prize, Maximianus thought, though the horse seemed to have two peculiar traits. It refused to understand commands unless they were barked in German, and it had a remarkable appetite for something the Naristi tribesmen called schnitzel. But should he amuse that young idiot Cassius, who had no experience in the battlefield, with his exciting stories? "Pull yourself together," Ulpia had snapped. When she was angry, her Greek accent got stronger. That was one of the many things Maximianus loved about her. If that Cassius really is writing a new history of our times, don't you want to make sure you're in it? And damn, she was right. She was always right. So Maximianus had reluctantly gone back to sorting his memories and sifting through old documents. He needed to be prepared for the dinner with Cassius Dio the twat. After all, as much as he loathed historians and their scribbling, wouldn't it be something to feature as one of the main protagonists in this grand new history? He had to admit his life was worth recording. Exciting, absolutely. Dangerous at times, yes. But that's what made it so exhilarating. Risky operations deep in enemy territory, secret missions under the cover of darkness, brutal combat that left him drenched in glory or blood, depending on the day. It was never boring, never dull. He lived for the kind of action that poets wrote about, the kind of deeds that earned inscriptions in public squares. The girls at the Lupanar had certainly loved his stories, wide-eyed and breathless as they listened to his tales of daring heroism. Of course, that had been before Ulpia came along and put an end to his extracurricular activities. Still, if those girls could hang on his every word, surely this young Greek scribbler would too. Maximianus chuckled to himself. He'd give Cassius Dio the material of a lifetime. Let the twat write, as long as it was his name that went down in history. Maximianus could live with a little bit of scribbling. After all, no one would care about Cassius Dio in 100 years, but Maximianus, hero of the Naristi, that was a name worth remembering. Where was he? Yes, risky operations, secret missions, brutal combat. And, friends, for life. From the moment he joined the army as a young man, Maximianus had felt welcome, a brotherhood forged in fire and wine. It was a far cry from the stifling life of a sacerdotalis in his sleepy hometown in Pannonia Superior, like his father before him. For a brief and utterly uninspiring period, Maximianus had served as a pontifex. People always mistranslated that as priest, which made him bristle. A pontifex wasn't some robe-wearing hermit praying to the gods. It was a sacred official in a collegium, a group tasked with overseeing rites and ceremonies, important work, sure, but also mind-numbingly dull. Maximianus hadn't been cut out for a life of incense and sacrifice. The army, with its camaraderie, adventure, and occasional brush with death, was much more his style. Pannonia Superior had its charms, but it couldn't hold him. Besides, speaking of superior, the wine in Pannonia was anything but. It was as though the gods had decided that the soil of his homeland would produce only the sour and barely drinkable. It was his comrades who first introduced him to the finer things in life. The wine from Sorrento, for example, a bit rough around the edges, sure, but leagues ahead of the vinegar they served back home. And while Falernian wine was the gold standard, it had been far beyond his budget as a young recruit. Back then, a sip of Falernian was an event, a luxury for special occasions, not a daily indulgence. Still, the army had its perks. As he climbed the ranks, so too did the quality of his wine. Perhaps that was the real reward for service, not honor or glory, but access to the empire's finest vintages. Oh yes, that mariotic wine in Egypt. What a pleasure, a light, refreshing taste. Perfect for the hot climate on the Nile. He almost got addicted to it when he was stationed there as the prefect of the Ala Veterana Gallorum. And later, back in Pannonia, when he was stationed as a praepositus, a role that usually meant overseeing a navy unit, Maximianus was reminded just how little his old friends knew about the world. They wouldn't believe a word when he told them about mariotic wine, that sweet, fragrant nectar from Egypt. Pannonian simpletons. Of course, he was one of them at heart and would always return to his home region throughout his life. But when it came to wine, they were hopeless. Wine is wine, they'd say, drinking something that barely deserved the name. His time stationed along the Danube had been more than eventful. Maximianus directed several naval units, smaller contingents drawn from the empire's two great fleets at Misenum and Ravenna, along with segments of the Classis Britannica that normally patrolled the English Channel, based in modern-day Boulogne-sur-Mer. It was a patchwork operation, but he made it work. His duties were varied, and some were less public than others. For example, he was secretly in charge of a detachment of North African horsemen tasked with military intelligence. That kind of work was hush-hush. Officially, it didn't exist. He only ever spoke of it at night, whispering to Albina, his girlfriend at the time. Ah, Albina, the brunette in the pink dress, by the way, sitting a bit aside so not to raise suspicion. Albina had rented a little studio apartment on the second floor of his favorite tavern. She was beautiful and full of charm. The secrecy of their relationship, with its stolen moments and whispered conversations between the sheets, only added to the thrill. He sometimes wondered what Albina was doing now. They'd promised to stay in touch as pen pals, but that had proven challenging. For one, Albina couldn't read or write. Still, it was the thought that counted, wasn't it? While Maximianus was still lost in thoughts of Albina, his wife, Ulpia Aristonica, entered the breakfast room carrying a jug of their favorite Falernian wine. It was the good stuff, no problem to afford these days, now that his income exceeded 100,000 sesterzi a year. Ulpia looked tired. They'd both had one glass too many the night before. It must be 5 o'clock somewhere, she quipped, as she did every morning. Maximianus didn't even roll his eyes anymore. Every morning, the same joke. With practiced precision, she poured them both generous glasses. "So how's the inscription coming along, and the preparations for Cassius's visit?" she asked, settling into her seat. Then, with a sly smile, she added, "Now tell me that story again. I still can't believe that." Ulpia Aristonica was, after his illustrious career of course, the second best thing that had ever happened to him. He'd known it from the moment he took her out to that posh Italian place for their first date. A match made in heaven, truly. They were the last guests to leave, having lingered over sweet and aromatic Mamertine wine from Sicily long after the staff began clearing tables. It was so late, in fact, that he had to call a driver to get them home. She was the perfect companion. While his friends and colleagues endlessly complained about their wives, how they languished in boredom, chatted incessantly about dresses and gardening, or, worst of all, indulged in scandalous affairs, Ulpia was different. Faithful as Juno, the mother of gods herself, Ulpia possessed a noble sense of purpose. Unlike the other expat wives who frittered away their days in idle gossip, Ulpia truly immersed herself in the local society wherever they were stationed. Giving back, contributing, it was so important, wasn't it? Upon arriving in Diana Veteranorum, she had immediately founded the Wine Tasting Society and, in no time, was triumphantly elected as its first president. Maximianus couldn't have been prouder. After all, an army wife too needed to have a purpose in life and should have a career of her own. He knew his friends mocked him, but he was a proud feminist. And he had Ulpia's back, as she had his. "Tell me the story," Ulpia repeated while she poured him a second glass of their breakfast wine. "Slow down, darling," Maximianus said as Ulpia poured the Falernian, her hand a little too eager for the early hour. "You know we're having an important guest for dinner tonight." He sighed and began to rehearse, starting from the beginning in Pannonia. This, after all, was the story he'd share with Cassius Dio later. Born in Poetovio, in the province of Pannonia Superior. Later they might call it Ptuj in Slovenia. Back then it wasn't much to look at, but it was home. My father was an equus Roman knight, second in rank after the senatorial class. He wasn't super rich, but definitely richer than most in those parts. Did I tell you that he also commissioned 2 inscriptions? Otherwise he was a magistrate and owned a farm in the countryside, a decent stretch of land. I still remember playing around with him there, pretending I was a general leading armies of chicken and geese. "No," Ulpia interrupted. "No, already bored." She signaled a slave to fetch a fresh jug of Falernian. "Not that story. Tell me about that weird wine they drink in Britain. That's the story that I want to hear." Ah, of course, that story. Yes. He had started his equestrian career as a prefect of the first Thracian cohort. There were several units with that name scattered across the Roman Empire, so future historians would no doubt scratch their heads trying to figure out where exactly Maximianus had been sent for his first post. But that wasn't a problem for him. He knew perfectly well that his cohort was stationed in Britain. And Britain, well, the wine there, it was a peculiar drink. They called it cervisia. Strange stuff. It looked like a cloudy, frothy wine, but the taste by Dionysus. It had a bitter, sharp taste, a bit like chewing on burned bread, and it lacked the elegance of anything resembling Falernian. And the ingredients? Maximianus shook his head. They made it from grain, not grapes, he said, his voice full of disdain. Barbarians, Ulpia interjected, rolling her eyes. She had now abandoned the breakfast table entirely, deciding that reclining on a couch was far more dignified. And is it true, she asked, propping herself up on one elbow with her glass of wine, is it true that one drinks this cervisia wine much quicker than our wine? Yes, and that's exactly the problem with cervisia, Maximianus admitted. At first, it's manageable, but after your 10th or 15th goblet, that's how they call glasses, it's as if the gods have cursed your bladder and every aqueduct in Rome has burst at once. Ulpia laughed, spilling a bit of Falernian onto the floor. No wonder they build so many bathhouses up there at the moment. They probably need places to recover. Maximianus sighed. Cervisia. Just one more reason he was glad to have left Britain behind. But if the emperor sent him back there, he'd go without hesitation. That was his duty to the imperial house, his loyalty unwavering. Unlike historians such as this bloody Tacitus, who loved nothing more than wagging his finger at the supposed mistakes of their God-given rulers. He wondered what that Cassius Dio twat would think about such things. No doubt the young scribbler would have some proud opinion. Ulpia was snoring, and Maximianus's thoughts turned to his inscription. This was not just a piece of stone carved with his name. It was a monument, a testament to decades of service to Rome, the greatest empire ever. And the inscription, a record of loyalty, sacrifice, and triumph. Maximianus considered the emperors under whom he had served. Marcus Aurelius, his brother Lucius Verus, and now Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius. Each of them embodied the pure greatness of Rome in their own way. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, had been a leader of unyielding resolve. During the grueling Marcomannic Wars, Maximianus had fought under his banner, enduring brutal campaigns that tested both body and spirit. Those wars were harsh, yes, but utterly necessary to defend Rome's borders and crush barbarian defiance. Lucius Verus, meanwhile, was Rome's answer to ambition. His campaigns against the Parthians, mental note, don't spell them Parthians, struck at the heart of the ancient enemy's power, expanding Rome's reach to new dimensions. Disease and shortages made the campaigns brutal. The soldiers had brought the plague into the empire, but to Maximianus, Rome's glory was worth it. And then there was Commodus, younger, bolder, and flamboyant, but every bit the Roman. Say what you would about his style, but his continuation of the Marcomannic Wars showed that Rome's strength lay in its unshakable resolve to face threats head-on. Peace through conquest. That was the Roman way. To Maximianus, wars weren't just about bloodshed and territory. They brought glory, spoils, and nights of celebration. They validated the empire's divine mission. The policies of the emperors, regardless of costs, were proof to Maximianus that Rome was destined to rule the world, and he was proud to have played his part. Just a decade ago, Marcus Aurelius had sent Maximianus east, to Syria to be precise. At the time, he had just been promoted to praepositus of a cavalry unit with the rank of centenarius. The title came with that comfortable annual salary of 100,000 sestertii, a tidy sum for a man who preferred danger and glory to spreadsheets and wax tablets. His cavalry was an unusual unit, composed of former enemies, Marcomanni, Naristi, and Quadi, but Maximianus had a knack for turning opponents into loyal fighters. Together, they made the long journey east to help quell the usurpation of Avidius Cassius in 175 CE. This Avidius Cassius had once been a loyal subject and close friend of the co-emperor Lucius Verus. He'd held prestigious positions in Syria and Egypt, a true pillar of the empire. But then disaster struck, or rather fake news did. A letter arrived falsely claiming that Marcus Aurelius, now sole ruler after Lucius Verus' death in 169, had also died. Avidius Cassius saw an opportunity. Why not step in and replace the supposedly beloved but very dead emperor? The problem, of course, was that Marcus Aurelius was very much alive. By the time Avidius Cassius realized his mistake, it was too late. He'd already gone from loyal servant to full-blown usurper. To make things even more awkward, Marcus Aurelius, Stoic philosopher that he was, reportedly wanted to pardon Avidius Cassius. After all, the man had been reliable once before. Unfortunately for Cassius, his own troops weren't as forgiving. They solved the problem before the emperor could, ending Avidius Cassius's life in rather final terms. Maximianus celebrated the end of the campaign in Syria the way any sensible man would, with wine. He had been there before in his life when he was a tribune of the Cohors Prima Hamiorum Civium Romanorum, at the second post of his career. But now, in 175, he had his first taste of Gaza's finest, a sweet aromatic wine with a hint of sun-dried figs and honey. Who would have thought that the Palestinians could produce such a delicious drop? The rich, velvety flavor was unlike anything he had tasted in Pannonia or during the Marcomannic Wars, and Maximianus decided that this, at least, was one good thing about the East. Besides Ulpia Aristonica, of course, whom he had met at a local wine-tasting event. For Maximianus, the campaign had been yet another success. Not only did it boost his reputation, it also came with another salary promotion. Money isn't a topic for polite conversation, but it surely provided content for his inscription in Diana Veteranorum. The people should see how much he earned. By the way, he had to wake up Ulpia, who had to supervise the servants cooking the dinner for that self-declared historian Cassius, who would show up in a few hours. It was already afternoon and still so much to do. Ulpia. So, back to his notes. Next, he was made procurator of Moesia Inferior, his first non-military posting. Though the role was more administrative, his reputation as a military man preceded him. Marcus Aurelius soon had him back in action, fighting brigands along the borders of Macedonia and Thracia. This, of course, was no problem for Maximianus. After all, his real talents lay in the field, not behind a desk. Over time, he served as procurator in several provinces, including Moesia Superior and Dacia Parolicensis. Wherever there was trouble, Maximianus was sent to sort it out, and he always did. Bureaucrat or not, he was a soldier at heart. His next post brought him back to the Danube, and with it a wave of nostalgia, or so he claimed. In truth, Maximianus had another reason to look forward to his time on the frontier. He had sent a letter to reconnect with Albina. Perhaps she had learned how to read by now, a romantic gamble, no doubt. What he didn't know, however, was that Ulpia had discovered his letter. True to form, she didn't confront him, she simply burned it. Maximianus would remain blissfully unaware of his thwarted correspondence for the rest of his days. It was during the time when Marcus Aurelius was sharing rule again, this time with his son, Commodus, that Maximianus reached an entirely new level of prestige. He was promoted into the senatorial rank. Now this was an honor. His father, for all his money and status, had never even come close, and Ulpia, she couldn't have been prouder. She hosted a celebration that was the talk of Pannonia. Wine flowed like the Danube in flood season. The next morning, Maximianus was so hungover he swore 5 legions were marching through his skull, while Ulpia annoyingly looked as composed as ever. The new rank wasn't just for show, though. Along with it came a plum assignment. He was made legatus of the Legio Prima Adiutrix, stationed once again in Pannonia Superior. It was a logical choice. After all, who better to command the Prima Adiutrix than the man who had so ably led the Secunda Adiutrix in Pannonia Inferior? Prima, Secunda, Superior, Inferior, Potato, Potado. Maximianus had no idea what a potato was, but the phrase felt appropriate. From 179 to 180, Maximianus and his legion wintered in Laugarizio, modern-day Trenčín in Slovakia, deep in enemy territory, 120 kilometers north of the Danube. They left an inscription there, boldly proclaiming their presence. For a long time, historians would dismiss it as a forgery, but in 1955, the long inscription from Diana Veteranorum in Numidia confirmed the content of the Laugarizio inscription. The text from Numidia, the text that would be chiseled tomorrow by the stonecutter, referenced Laugarizio, proving once and for all that Maximianus had indeed marched his men deep into barbarian lands and made sure everybody knew about it. Maximianus had always said inscriptions were more reliable than historians. He wasn't wrong. He thought back to the winter camp in Laugarizio. What a disaster that had been in terms of food. The locals insisted on serving that schnitzel stuff, and by the gods it was not to his taste. He shuddered at the memory. But there was no time for nostalgia. Bloody hell, the dinner! Only 2 hours left until Lucius Cassius was due to arrive. The sound of shouting erupted from the kitchen quarters. Ulpia was at it again, this time locked in mortal combat with their new chef. An impressive string of Greek curses flew through the air, echoing down the halls. Maximianus, for once, was grateful he had never truly mastered Greek. Latin had always served him well enough in the army, and he intended to keep it that way. When he entered the kitchen, he found Ulpia mid-rampage, smashing plates onto the floor with a kind of rage that even the Germanic tribes couldn't muster in battle. Maximianus winced, generally worried she might destroy that new refrigerium he had bought her at the Emporium Mechanicum. Why hadn't he gone for the extended warranty option? He was a stingy idiot. "Let's focus on the wine menu, arapimo," he said, using one of the few Greek phrases he had picked up. She glared at him for a moment, then relented. Together, they selected the finest wines. Of course, there was a lot of tasting involved in this exercise. In the end, they settled on Falernian and Gazian wine, and for the grand finale, a vintage from Chios in Greece. If this didn't impress Lucius Cassius, nothing would. Satisfied with their choices, Ulpia returned to terrorizing the staff, while Maximianus retreated to his study. He needed to prepare. There were documents to sort and stories to rehearse for their illustrious guest, that which trod with his quill and parchment. If Cassius Dio wanted tales of heroism, he would get them, closely polished and entirely unforgettable. Okay, back to his notes, with a full glass of Falernian, of course. If you stuck to one vintage, you would feel it tomorrow. That much Maximianus knew. As he leafed through the pile of documents, he spotted an old receipt for an inscription from Apulum. 36 letters, 5 lines. What in Pluto's name was that about? Ah, yes, of course, the Mithraeum. There was more to life than fighting and drinking. After all, religion mattered. You had to thank the gods at some point, another truth Maximianus knew. Like many of his fellow soldiers, he had been drawn to Mithras, the eastern god of the sun, the god of the eastern sun, the sun god of the... Gosh, that Falernian was strong. Anyway, it made sense. What better deity for men who lived by their sword? The rituals were mysterious, the symbolism powerful, and it didn't hurt that Mithras was also associated with victory. And victory had come again and again. Mithras had surely smiled on Maximianus as he rose through the ranks, commanding not 1 but 3 legions in quick succession. The 5th legion, Macedonica in Dacia, probably Censis. The 1st legion, Italica in Moesia Inferior. And the 13th legion, Gemina in Dacia. This was no small feat. Even a silver-spoon senator like Cassius would have to tip his cap to a career like this. In Apulum, where the 13th legion was stationed, Maximianus had commissioned an inscription in the local Mithraeum. The carved stone was proof of his devotion, a record for the gods, and for history that he, Marcus Valerius Maximianus, honored Mithras. After all, a man's deeds might fade, but an inscription that could last forever. By the gods, he's not going to care about your bloody inscriptions, Ulpia grumbled, swaying slightly as she reappeared from the kitchen. She was, to put it delicately, spectacularly intoxicated. Tell him about the Tres Militiae, how your career outshone every other equus. Honestly, why else would they have promoted you to senatorial rank? Ah, and she wasn't wrong. His career had far exceeded the usual path for a Roman knight. The Tres Militiae, the standard career progression for equestrians, was a rigidly defined ladder, a sort of cursus honorum light for the second-tier elites. Most knights would follow the same 3-step plan. First, prefect of a cohort, then military tribune, and finally prefect of an ala, a cavalry wing. If they did well, they might eventually nab one of the 3 high-ranking prefectures available to equestrians. Maximianus had always found the Tres Militiae dreadfully predictable, standardized, just like everything else the Emperor Trajan, of blessed memory, had ever touched. Maximianus' disdain for mediocrity extended even to tombstones, as Ulpia well knew. On their honeymoon in Italy, when she wanted to visit a famous vineyard near Ancona, they had stumbled upon the gravestone of some unfortunate equus named Titus Conacidius Sabinus. Maximianus had spent an afternoon lecturing her on that man's career, a perfectly respectable one by ordinary standards. He'd started as a prefect of a cohort in Pannonia, gone on to Britain as a military tribune of the Legio Secunda Augusta, and kept it off as a prefect of the Ala Veterana Gallorum in Egypt, a classic example of a mobile Roman officer. But Maximianus had scoffed. Poor man, he'd said, a textbook career. Solid, yes, but compared to mine, ha! Ulpia had nodded dutifully at the time, as she did now on this evening, feigning interest as he waxed lyrical about his own meteoric rise, from cavalry commander to spy, killer of Valau the German, on to 3 legionary commands, and of course the Senate, and soon, surely, the consulship. Now, on this hot summer evening in the Anna Veteranorum, Maximianus was still going on about it. You see, Ulpia, my career wasn't just res militiae, it was quatuor militiae, quinque militiae even. But Ulpia, clutching a fresh glass of wine, had already tuned him out. One last drink before our guest arrives, she mumbled, poured herself a generous glass, and promptly fell asleep. Maximianus, ever the orator, talked himself into slumber not long after. The servants heard a knock at the door. Surely this must be the dinner guest their masters had been talking about all week. The chef, still seething from the earlier drama, muttered curses under his breath, while Ulpia's old maid, ever the voice of reason, waved him off. Let him sleep, she said. Tomorrow will be a tough day. The inscription is being unveiled. She paused, a hint of worry crossing her face. I really hope they caught that last typo. Parthians instead of Parthians? Gods, how embarrassing would that be? But what do I know? I can't read. Shaking her head, she draped a blanket over her sleeping mistress and gently pried the wineglass from her hand. Let him sleep, she repeated, as the muffled knock echoed again from the front door. Cassius Dio stood at the door, hungry, thirsty, and increasingly annoyed as his knocks went unanswered. He grumbled to himself about the rudeness of it all. He was here as a guest, looking forward to hearing the famous account of Maximianus's killing of Valau, the chief of the Naristi. He admired Maximianus, a true war hero, unlike that Emperor Commodus, of whom Dio was far more critical than our soldiers seemed to be. But this was a violation of his dignity. If they didn't open the door soon, he swore to himself, there would be consequences. If he ever finished his grand Roman history, he'd make sure there was no mention of Maximianus in it. Or of his wife Ulpia, for that matter, the self-important president of that little wine-tasting society of Diana Veteranorum. And so it went. There is indeed no mention of Marcus Valerius Maximianus in Cassius Dio's Roman history, or in any other literary source about these times. If it weren't for his plentiful inscriptions scattered across the empire, we wouldn't know a thing about him at all. The next morning, Maximianus awoke to a pounding headache that felt like God Vulcanus himself was hammering inside his skull. Worse still, news arrived that Cassius Dio had left the city. Maximianus groaned, but only for a moment. "Nah, who cares?" he muttered, reaching for a glass of water, or possibly more breakfast wine. "Who needs historians anyway?" Time passed as it always did, and Maximianus' star continued to rise. A year later, he held one of the most prestigious positions in the empire, governor of the province of Africa. As governor, he was also the supreme commander of the Legio Tertia Augusta, the backbone of Rome's control in the region. North Africa suited him well, and true to form, he left behind more inscriptions proclaiming his deeds. But his crowning achievement was yet to come. Maximianus reached the pinnacle of Roman political life. He was to become consul of the empire. Inscriptions from North Africa proudly name him consul designatus, or consul, in around the time between 183 and 185. Most likely he carried out this highest of honors in absentia, remaining in Africa while officially holding the post. To Maximianus, it must have felt like the final validation of a life dedicated to Rome. And then the trail runs cold. After his tenure as consul, Maximianus vanishes from the historical record. If it wasn't for his inscriptions, scattered across the empire like breadcrumbs for curious epigraphers, we wouldn't know a thing about Marcus Valerius Maximianus. There was no Cassius Dio to immortalize him. Just stone and memory, quietly enduring where the man himself could not. At some point, there must have been a funerary inscription. This tombstone, if it ever existed, has not survived, or perhaps it still waits, buried beneath the sands of Africa for an archaeologist's spade to reveal its secrets. This is why inscriptions are so vital. They bridge the gap where history books fall silent, preserving the fragments of lives that would otherwise be lost to time. Much of the narrative surrounding the life of Marcus Valerius Maximianus has been fictionalized for this video. Ulpia did not, as far as we know, found the wine-tasting society of Diana Veteranorum, though who's to say she didn't? What we do have are the inscriptions, the enduring words of Maximianus himself, as well as 3 from his wife and 2 from his father. These epigraphic texts allow us to piece together the biography of a man otherwise ignored by the historians of his age. Except for his governorship and consulship, which postdate the inscription from Diana Veteranorum, much of what we know about Maximianus derives from this very long text. Earlier in this video, I provided my translation of this inscription, adapted from the published translation by Brian Campbell. If you missed it, I encourage you to revisit that section or consult Campbell's sourcebook for the full text. Even in modern historiography, Marcus Valerius Maximianus is more of a side character than a leading figure. Nevertheless, I've listed several references here that provide further insights into his life and the circumstances of his time. History often overlooks figures like Maximianus, but thanks to his inscriptions, his story, at least in parts, endures.